in a way, what science is all about is it will tell you what is possible. If you want to know if something is possible, you ask the expert in that science. But what science can't tell you, and what you usually really want to know, is out of the class of the possible, what things will actually occur? And we have no theory for this, strangely enough. We have no theory for out of the class of the I suppose somebody who was a fundamentalist or some kind of Christian might say, well, God's will. Out of the class of what is possible, what comes to be is God's will. Well, that would be one theory of what it is that winnows the actual from the possible. A scientist would say pre-existing conditions. In other words, somehow the circumstances into which any phenomenon is born skew it toward its ultimate developmental end state. This is the idea. It's almost like the law of karma or something, that by the circumstances into which you find yourself, then you are carried forward to some conclusion that was inevitable based on that. Novelty theory is not predestination. It doesn't say that the future has happened. If you believe the future has happened, you have all kinds of philosophical problems on your hands, because, for truth as a concept to have any meaning, you have to have error. If you think what you think because you can't think anything else, which is what predestination is, well then what does the search for truth and meaning look like in a cosmos like that? It's meaningless. No. In a predestined cosmos, you think what you think because that's what you think and you can't think anything else, and it doesn't have anything to do with truth. So there must be at least that much freedom to err in the mind. But of course, the mind through the body is an extension into the world. For all the huffing and puffing of modern science and neurophysiology, they still can't tell you how you can think, I will close my hand and close it. This is mind over matter. This is telekinesis. This is, science is just completely baffled as to how this can take place at all. It's a fundamental miracle. Been good for 5,000 years, still knocking them dead. And it's by that trick that we don't understand how it's done that will and mind and intent enters the world, and cities get built and armies sent marching and religious revelations written down and so forth and so on. But I think that you see, for years I was like crying in the wilderness about this ramping up towards some kind of hyper-complex unravelment of the social machine in the very short term. But now I feel much more confident than I was 10 years ago. The internet looks to me like the backbone of the emergent thing. The internet is a huge and not fully comprehended cultural step that we have now totally committed ourselves to. It's nothing less than the building of a thinking nervous system the size of the entire planet. And our most important, we're wedded to this thing. Our banking, military planning, corporate capitalization, long-term planning, design process, inventory control, resource extraction, everything is running on this strange companion that we we built to be indestructible because we built it at the height of the Cold War. And so, it has no nodes of control, and it's the most complex thing ever put in place on this planet since DNA, cooked itself out of the primal ocean.
Again, somehow are those people that have had these experiences going to be spared a certain type of...
you put your finger on it. It's that to the degree that people are psychedelic, they will be less anxious about what will happen. Because what psychedelics show you is that there is life after history. There is something outside of culture. If you don't know that, by one means or another, then you will define what is happening as, the end of the world, the literal apocalypse, the collapse of everything, when in fact that's not what it is. It's just the collapse of historical, print-based, cultural models and models of the self and the psyche. I embrace it. We're not about to blow out here or go extinct, and we never escaped from the yoke of nature. Nature has taken some hits in this neighborhood. 65 million years ago, an object encountered the Earth that nothing larger than a chicken on the entire planet survived that encounter. And guess what it cleared the way for? The flowering plants, the source of all these compounds we're so interested in, and the ascendancy of the mammalian order, our dear selves. We are here because of the most appalling bad hair day this planet ever endured. So, when you start judging this stuff and saying, what's good, what's bad, it's very hard to say. Nature is incredibly profligate and will take enormous chances to preserve novelty, to keep the novelty game going. And so I feel, that in a sense nature will open a way for us. Nature is interested in this process. We represent the greatest step in organizational realignment and redesign since life left the ocean. Yeah.
It's grace. It's the will of God that makes these more and more complex systems fall into place.
This relates to a question which was unanswered here this morning, which was about teleology. The Darwinian theory of evolution is very hostile to teleology. First of all, what is teleology? Teleology is the idea that the universe has a purpose. And Darwinian evolution is hostile to this because Darwinian evolution arose in 19th century England, where the reigning intellectual paradigm was called deism. And deism is the idea that God made the universe like a clockmaker, and then he went away and left it going. In other words, the divine clockmaker. The universe was structured by a force which has now withdrawn from it. And Darwin and his circle were very clearly atheistic, and they wanted to see biology as requiring no purpose to direct it at all. And so they created the dual concept of random mutation and natural selection. Random mutation is just that because of copying errors, radiation, drift, toxic material in the cellular environment, that the DNA messages degrade. So that's mutation. Then random selection is that this DNA is then subjected to the selective winnowing out that the environment lays against it. So by the meshing of these two processes, this is Darwinian theory, by the meshing of random mutation and natural selection, you get the slow incremental emergence of new forms. And these forms, some of which confer advantage and some don't. Most don't, and they're eliminated. Those that do stay in the system, and incrementally the system seeks to come to equilibrium with the selective forces that are operating on it. But these selective forces, which are continent, incidental radiation from space, weather, climate change, so forth and so on, because these factors are themselves changing over time, mutating, the system can never come to equilibrium. And so for Darwinian evolution, evolution is what's called a random walk. The system destabilizes, it corrects itself. It destabilizes, it corrects. Destabilizes, corrects. And after billions of years of this, lo and behold, you get animals like ourselves. But these 19th century evolutionists were keen to say, do not imagine that this is God's purpose, or that the final form was prefigured in the original form. No, this just happened like this. Well, now we've had 150 years to absorb all this. In the meantime, Mendelian genetics, the particulate nature of the gene has been understood. The molecular nature of the gene has been understood. We can say some new things about this. Also, we are no longer under the spell of deism. That's a crank idea that nobody is that keen for. And so it's a different intellectual world. Well, now when we look at nature, we see a different picture. We see that where Darwin said nature is all red in tooth and claw, we see that the way to be a successful species, the way to survive, is to make yourself indispensable to your neighbors. Then, instead of attempting to push you down and extinguish you, if you can cut deals with everybody in your neighborhood, providing various chemicals or energy supplies or other affects in the environment, then everybody will begin to pull your way. So, in fact, cooperation is what is maximized among species. And a huge complex organic system like a coral reef or a rainforest is actually attempting to come to an equilibrium of balance that is the point of greatest benefit for the greatest number of organisms and species in the system. Well, this is a whole different picture. And it opens the possibility, these new sciences like complexity theory, global dynamics, chaos theory, have made it now respectable to think about processes that are drawn by something in the future rather than pushed from behind. In the 19th century, that was inconceivable. All that was known was the chain of cause and effect. But now we see that the temporal landscape has what are called basins of attraction in it, and that certain processes are actually drawn forward by their presumed end states. And so it seems less outlandish to us, I think, to suppose there is a purpose. And also we see a level of global integration and global mutation that Darwin couldn't have even dreamed of either.
The idea of elements of time having their particular qualities, have you correlated that with astrology at all?
Well, it's somewhat like astrology, except astrology believes that planets and stars and the arrangements among them represent shifts in a kind of energy field. In a way, this is more abstract. Wang Pi, who was a medieval Chinese mystic, his thought comes eerily close to my own, in that the way he pictured this was that you have the sequence moving in an abstract dimension, but you have the sequence moving at a certain speed, and overlaying that is another sequence moving at a different speed, and over that another version of the King-Wen sequence moving at another speed, and that a given moment is a slice through these levels that creates a unique juxtaposition of the levels. So it is in that sense very astrological, but it's all calculated independent of any observation of nature. Although, if it's true, then it's interesting that there are correlations in the cycles in the King-Wen sequence to astrological cycles. Specifically, the system that I elaborated on one level contains a cycle of 384 days. That's the number of lines, 6 times 64, the number of lines in a complete sequence of the I Ching, 384 days. Well, it happens to be 13 lunar cycles, exactly. Well, then if you take it times 64, you get a number, 67 years, 0.10425 days, which is 6 sunspot cycles. And sunspot cycles also occur in 33-year cycles. Well, it's known that the early Han Dynasty Chinese knew about sunspot cycles. They were the first people to observe them. So, without hypothesizing super technologies or any kind of Atlantis type stuff, we see that the King-Wen sequence could have been a kind of gear used in a system of multiplicans that predicted lunar cycles, sunspot cycles on 2 levels, and then with one further multiplication, this precessional great year, this 26,300 year cycle. So it's a neat kind of resonance calendar, and given the sorry state of Chinese calendar making in historical time, it's interesting that you can derive a very accurate calendar from the I Ching, more accurate than the calendar we're presently operating on. If you use a 384-day year length, the problem, of course, is that a year of that length would precess against the sun. But this may have been for political or religious or philosophical reasons acceptable at the time that calendar was formulated. My fancy is that there was a war, a calendrical war in the pre-Shang dynasty time, a war between the solar materialists and the lunar mystics. And it was basically a war about how the calendar should be, because, the calendar is the largest frame of reality. For instance, our calendar, with its fixed equinoctial points, is a lie. Our calendar promotes a belief in the permanence of eternity, when in fact everything is slipping and sliding around. The fact that the equinoctial points are traversed every year on the same solar year day gives rise to a kind of patriarchal hubris, arguably. Yeah.
The difference between a schizophrenic and a psychedelic traveler being that maybe one can't navigate its way back. And I was wondering 2 things. One is, have you had any work with schizophrenics, and what was that interaction like? And the other was more a take on modern culture, the common channel surfing couch potato, that it has some schizophrenic quality to it. And I was thinking of the movie 12 Monkeys, the Brad Pitt character in the asylum, when he says that the thing that separates a sane citizen from insanity is how much he allows his culture to straitjacket him.
Well, I don't know. Schizophrenia is a very complicated subject because several syndromes, which are quite different, are all lumped under schizophrenia. Probably the kind of schizophrenia that I am sensing you want to talk about is what's called process schizophrenia. This is where somebody becomes really spun up, and it can come after days of not sleeping or something, and then people begin to have really funny ideas, and they want to tell everybody about them, and they want to take, they go to the manager of the business with fantastic ideas that are going to make a whole bunch of money. The problem is they just don't make sense to anybody but them, or they start hearing voices, or they become convinced that they have a special mission. And it turns out that this phenomenon, which we pathologize pretty confidently, actually is not that different from people who are having real legitimate breakthroughs and understanding their lives in new ways. It's a shifting and reordering of the dominance of the psyche. And I tend to agree, he's dead now, but R.D. Laing, the English psychiatrist R.D. Laing, what I observed of schizophrenia went on at La Chirera in those days that are described in True Hallucinations, and my really strong conviction coming out of that was it should not be interfered with by depressive drugs, that it's some kind of a process, of a healing, of an acting out, and that the biggest favor you can do the person is to let them, to the greatest degree possible, do what they want to do and not interfere with them. And if you medicate them and incarcerate them, the thing is aborted and squashed and distorted, and then they have a great deal of trouble ever getting their act together. I was very fortunate. I mean, how many psychiatric residents have ever seen an untreated schizophrenic? I mean, the minute these people hit the front door of a hospital, they're given stelazine or lithium or something, and yet, it seems more as though Jung was on the right track. This is a process in the dynamics of the unconscious that wants to work itself out to a conclusion. Now, obviously, if they have violent fantasies or seem dangerous to themselves or other people, you can't let that go on. But I think the treatment of schizophrenia is largely at the convenience of the practitioner. And people are warehoused, and, if I were going crazy, I think the thing that would really throw me over the edge would be to be put with a bunch of really crazy people. It's always seemed so odd to me that if you go bananas, they put you with all the other people who've gone bananas, who are the worst models for you to be in the presence of, and are quite unsettling to normal people, let alone people who are having boundary dissolution and self-identity problems. So, yeah.
There's some studies that show that what it creates is in schizophrenic states, there's a more common shift in brainwave rhythms, which is associated with an enhanced immune system and resultant less cancer. And I've been curious as to whether or not the use of psychedelics may also provide those frequent shifts, which are probably more necessary to health. So as soon as we depress, for instance, schizophrenics, what happens is they go back to normal cancer rate of the normal population, so their immune system doesn't function as well. So in terms of looking at enhanced immune function, whether or not frequent shifts, which coming in and out of psychedelics may, and I don't know if you know anything about that.
Well, in some sense, the kind of process schizophrenia, the messianic, grandiose schizophrenia that we're talking about here, is an overexpression of self-definition. And in that sense, you would expect an enhanced immune system to accompany it. The immune system defines the chemical self. So if the self is somehow being overexpressed to the point where it becomes a pathology or a burden on the functioning of the social group, then it wouldn't surprise me that the immune system would be functioning very efficiently